Now, look, it's a mystery to me why the G7 leaders fly halfway around the world and make very little impact or comment on the one critical issue the free world faces, China. Beijing was scrubbed from the final G7 communique. What with the so-called group of 7 wealthy democracies, Britain, the United States, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan? We're not part of the G7, but we received an invite. What were they trying to say in a joint 25-page communique? They were asking China to, quote, respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. And the G7 will continue to consult on how to challenge China's behaviour in the global economy. Some of these political heroes who want to be called leaders were worried that forceful language might antagonise China. The best Biden could say was America is back on the table. That's a backhander to Donald Trump. Yet China came at none of its capers while Trump was there. Biden went off to Windsor Castle for tea. One wonders how the Queen coped with his incoherence. But how interesting that the final communique made no mention of China's use of slave labour, other than the need to, quote, respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, unquote. How that fits with the genocide of ethnic Uighurs, a Muslim minority group, and using forced labour in Xinjiang, which the Chinese government has called lies. But then, the Melbourne Age today headlines, quote, Victoria continued to use Uighur labour firm. A firm linked to, yes, Uighur slave labour. This is the undemocratic Republic of Victoria. A $2.4 billion train project, a Chinese state-owned company involved, KTK Group, which uses Muslim Uighur workers. And indeed, the train manufacturer confirmed it acquired scores of these Uighur workers. So get your head around this. On the one hand, these so-called leaders beside the beach in Cornwall are scorning the fact that China is using forced labour. And here in Australia, Dictator Dan is having 65 trains built in China, part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and reports suggest that about 80,000 members of the persecuted Uighur minority were shifted out of their homes or detention camps to work in factories so that Dan can have his trains built. But of course, the Victorian government will seek to lie its way out of trouble. Victoria complies with modern slavery laws, the government now tells us. Next thing, they'll be telling us there are tooth fairies at the bottom of the garden. You get the drift? The G7 makes high and mighty noises about slave labour and human rights, fundamental freedoms, but they can't see beyond the nose on their face. China are laughing. A 25-page communique from the G7 which will have no practical effect. And don't be too tough, it might antagonise China. So that's why nothing happened about coronavirus, except there'll be, quote, a transparent probe. Probing what? The coronavirus thing gets worse. There are now reports that a high-ranking Chinese defector has confirmed that China's People's Liberation Army was in control at the lab in Wuhan. As James Morrow indicates splendidly today, these latest reports confirm what another Chinese defector told authorities last year about the involvement of the People's Liberation Army, no less, in the lab. Remember when Facebook scrubbed people who suggested the virus might have escaped from a lab? And the prestigious Lancet medical journal published open letters stating that the virus emerged in nature. What was the agenda here? Well, as the Australian Flinders University Director of Endocrinology, Professor Nikolai Petrovsky, has said, and I quote, this resulted in a politicisation of science, with scientists as a body deciding that to question the origins of the virus was to be a supporter of Trump. Now many scientists are slowly opening their eyes and realising they might have been duped by their own colleagues who'd authored the Lancet and Nature Medicine commentaries together with a mass of Chinese propaganda and, of course, their own prejudices that anything Trump said could not be true, unquote. Now, any of this of interest at the G7 before they had their lobsters and their morning tea? The two people tied up in America over this were the chief advisor to the then President Fauci and his mate Daszak, the bloke who emailed a congratulatory message to Fauci because Fauci kept arguing the virus was naturally occurring. Then this Daszak gets appointed to the WHO investigation to investigate the source of the virus. The investigating team never mentioned that any bats were kept at the Wuhan Institute. And in that institute, remember, they were conducting this gain-of-function research. The body Fauci heads, the American National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, gave $600,000 to this research, which was creating a more lethal and transmissible virus. But of course, Daszak said it was a conspiracy to suggest the bats were held at the Institute, tweeting, "No bats were sent to Wuhan lab for genetic analysis of viruses collected in the field. That's not how this science works. We release bats when we catch them." A lie. There's now footage revealing live bats in cages. Then came the Fauci emails. So both Fauci and Daszak have been forced to admit that the Wuhan Institute of Virology may have housed bats. As I mentioned to you last week, way back in February 2020, and as James Morrow reports again today, the Scripps Research Institute scientist, Dr. Christian Anderson, warned Dr. Fauci that there was every possibility that the virus came from a lab. February 2020, that, quote, "Some of the features look engineered." Here we have world leaders meeting in Cornwall, and the best they can say is they want a transparent probe into the origins of COVID-19. You see, one truth emerges from all this. None of these people ought to admit that Trump was right in the first place. The public have more guts than our spineless political leaders and want to know whether Fauci and co will get away with all of this. And if you're fearing about slave labour, Scott Morrison, pull on an inquiry into whether or not Dictator Dan is building 65 metro trains using exploited Uighur workers. And Prime Minister, if you led the call for an inquiry into Fauci and his mates and established an inquiry into who built the trains for Dictator Dan, you could be a hero. The public are not going to cop this rubbish for much longer. What do my viewers think? Email me. Love to hear from you. Alan@skynews.com.au. The text line 0414 000 848.